There is a kingdom hidden in plain sight, not beneath the ocean, not among the stars, but right above your head, watching, remembering, waiting. A world painted in charcoal black, where intelligence moves on silent wings, where memory lasts for decades, and where a single glance from the sky might already know who you are. Tonight, we are not just observing the crow, we are entering its mind, a mind that has survived since the age of dinosaurs, outlived mass extinctions, learned to bend tools, outsmart machines, and even read human faces like pages in a book. A mind that holds funerals, forms lifelong bonds, plays for no reason at all, and speaks in a language we are only beginning to understand. But here is the unsettling part. The crow is not just studying the world, it is studying us. And the deeper you go into this journey, the more you begin to feel it. That quiet presence, that awareness, that sense that you are not the only one listening. So tonight, don't just watch. Let yourself drift, slowly, gently, into the Graphite Kingdom. And before we begin, if this kind of deep, immersive journey speaks to you, I need a small favor. This channel is still growing, still finding its place, and your support means everything right now. If you can, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me on this path. It truly helps more than you might think. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let the story begin. In the quiet hours when the world softens and the edges of thought begin to blur, there is a story older than memory. A story written not in ink, but in feather and bone, in shadow and sky. Long before cities hummed with electric light, before forests whispered in the language we now recognize, there were creatures who watched the turning of the earth with an intelligence both ancient and unyielding. Among them, the ancestors of the crow. If you follow the thread of their existence far enough back, deeper than the rise of mammals, deeper even than the first birds as we know them, you arrive in a world ruled by giants. The age of dinosaurs. It may seem impossible at first to imagine that the sleek black crow perched on a telephone wire today shares a lineage with creatures that once shook the ground with every step. But evolution is not a straight line. It is a quiet sculptor, patient beyond comprehension. The earliest relatives of birds were small, feathered dinosaurs, agile, observant, and already experimenting with the gift of flight. Over millions of years, as climates shifted and continents drifted apart, these early beings adapted, refined, survived. And survival, in this story, is everything. Because the Earth has not always been kind. There were moments, sudden and catastrophic, when life itself seemed to falter. The most famous of these was the Great Extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. A cosmic collision, an asteroid striking the planet with unimaginable force, casting dust into the sky, blocking sunlight, collapsing ecosystems across land and sea. Nearly 3/4 of all species vanished. The great dinosaurs, the rulers of that ancient world, disappeared. But not all of them. Some endured, small, feathered, adaptable, capable of finding food where others could not. Capable of sheltering, hiding, waiting. These were the ones who carried the lineage forward. These were the quiet survivors. And among their distant descendants, the crow. It is tempting to think of survival as luck, a fortunate accident of circumstance. But in truth, survival is often the result of subtle advantages, traits that seem insignificant in one era, yet become decisive in another. For early bird ancestors, one such advantage was intelligence. Not intelligence in the human sense, not yet, but the beginnings of it. Curiosity, flexibility, the ability to explore new food sources, to remember locations, to adjust behavior when the environment changed. When forests burned or froze, when familiar prey disappeared, those who could improvise had a chance. And over time, that chance became a pattern. The lineage that would one day become crows did not rely on strength alone, or speed alone, or even flight alone. They relied on something more subtle, something that could not be seen from the outside, a mind that could learn. Imagine a world in recovery after catastrophe, landscapes stripped bare, food scarce and unpredictable. In such a world, specialization becomes a weakness. A creature that depends on one specific food, one specific habitat, one specific pattern is fragile. But a generalist, a creature that can eat many things, live in many places, adapt its behavior, that creature endures. Crows became masters of this flexibility. They could feed on insects, seeds, carrion, scraps left behind by other animals. They could nest in trees, cliffs, and eventually structures created by humans. They could observe, remember, and adjust, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they spread across continents, across climates, across time. What is remarkable is not just that they survived, but how they survived. While many species evolved toward narrow perfection, becoming exquisitely suited to a specific niche, crows moved in the opposite direction. They became versatile, resilient, opportunistic in the most intelligent sense of the word. This is why, even today, they are found almost everywhere humans exist. Cities, forests, coastlines, deserts. Where others struggle, they persist. And yet, their story is not only about endurance, it is also about transformation. Because the crow you see today is not merely a survivor of ancient extinction. It is the result of millions of years of refinement. Its feathers, its eyes, its voice, its mind, all shaped by pressures both violent and subtle. Even the color of the crow, its deep, absorbing black, carries echoes of this history. Black in nature is rarely simple. It is not an absence, but a structure, a way of interacting with light. The crow's feathers are built to absorb and scatter wavelengths in complex ways, creating a surface that seems to drink in brightness. And yet, under certain angles, reveals hidden sheens of blue, violet, even green. A reminder that what appears plain may conceal layers unseen. In much the same way, the crow's mind holds depths that are not immediately visible. But that is a story that unfolds gradually. For now, it is enough to sit with the idea that intelligence, true adaptable intelligence, was not a sudden gift. It was carved slowly across epochs through trial and extinction and survival, each generation inheriting not just genes, but possibilities. And as the Earth continued to change, as mammals rose, as humans eventually appeared, the crow lineage did not retreat into obscurity. It watched, it learned, it adapted once again. There is something quietly profound about this continuity. While entire branches of life vanished, while ecosystems rose and fell like tides, the ancestors of the crow persisted, carrying with them a memory encoded not in thoughts, but in structure, a resilience written into their very being. And so when you hear a crow's call in the distance, sharp, deliberate, almost knowing, you are not just hearing a bird. You are hearing an echo of ancient forests, of skies filled with creatures long gone, of a lineage that refused to disappear, a lineage that learned how to remain. As the night deepens and the world grows still, it becomes easier to imagine that these birds are more than they seem. That behind those dark eyes lies not just instinct, but awareness shaped by deep time. And perhaps that is why they feel so familiar to us. Not because they are like us, but because in some quiet way they have been here, watching far longer than we have. And they are still here now, waiting, observing, adapting, as the story continues to unfold. And as that story continues, it begins to shift almost imperceptibly from time into light. Because to understand the crow fully, you have to see what it sees. At first glance, the crow appears simple in its appearance, a silhouette carved from shadow, a body of pure black, absorbing the daylight without reflection, as if it were made not of feathers, but of absence itself. But this is an illusion, a trick played by the limits of human perception. If you could step just slightly beyond your own senses, if your eyes could widen into a different spectrum, the crow would no longer appear black at all. Instead, it would shimmer. Beneath what we perceive as darkness lies a hidden architecture of light. Each feather is not merely colored, but constructed, layered with microscopic structures that bend and scatter wavelengths in precise ways. These structures interfere with light, breaking it apart, reshaping it, and sending fragments back toward the eye. To us, the result is a deep, velvety black. But to the crow, the story is entirely different, because crows, like many birds, can see into the ultraviolet spectrum, a realm of light invisible to human eyes. In that realm, their feathers are alive with subtle signals, patterns and glows that exist just beyond our awareness. What appears uniform to us is to them a shifting landscape of information. Imagine standing before a surface that looks perfectly smooth, and then, with a slight adjustment of your vision, discovering that it is covered in intricate markings, trails, signatures, identities written in light. That is the crow's world. And within that world, every feather speaks. These ultraviolet patterns are not random. They carry meaning, signals about health, age, vitality. They reveal details that help crows recognize one another, assess potential mates, navigate social interactions with a precision we can barely comprehend. A crow does not simply see another crow. It reads it. The angle of the light, the condition of the plumage, the subtle variations in reflectance, all of these become part of a silent conversation, unfolding continuously in the air between them. And yet, this hidden spectrum is only one layer. Even within the range of light we can see, the crow's feathers are far more complex than they appear. Under close observation, especially in the right conditions, their blackness fractures into iridescence, hints of blue, violet, even green shimmering along the edges. This is not pigment in the traditional sense. It is structure, an arrangement so precise that it manipulates light itself. Each feather is composed of tiny barbs and barbules, interlocking, forming a surface that is both flexible and incredibly intricate. Within these structures are nanoscale formations, melanin granules arranged in patterns that influence how light is absorbed and reflected. The result is a kind of optical alchemy, darkness that contains color. And perhaps this is why crows have always held such a powerful place in human imagination. They seem to exist at the boundary between visibility and invisibility, between what is seen and what is sensed. But for the crow, there is no mystery here. There is only clarity. Because its eyes are built for a different kind of seeing, the crow's vision is sharp, exceptionally so. Its eyes are positioned to allow both focused forward vision and wide peripheral awareness. It can track movement with precision, detect subtle changes in its environment, and process visual information at a speed that gives it a constant advantage. But more importantly, it interprets that information differently. Where humans might see a static scene, the crow sees patterns of change. Where we might notice color, the crow notices contrast, motion, relationships between objects. Its brain is tuned not just to capture images, but to extract meaning from them quickly. This ability is essential in a world where survival depends on constant awareness. A glint of movement in the grass, the shadow of a predator passing overhead, the presence of food hidden beneath leaves or soil. All of these must be detected and understood in an instant. And so the crow's visual system evolved to do more than see. It evolved to interpret. And in that interpretation, the world becomes richer, more detailed, more alive than we can easily imagine. Consider for a moment what it means to perceive ultraviolet light. Flowers, for example, often carry UV patterns, guides that lead pollinators to nectar. To us, a flower may appear uniformly colored, but to a bird, it may be marked with radiant pathways, glowing signs pointing inward. Now extend that idea outward, to landscapes, to other animals, to the sky itself. The crow moves through a world layered with signals we cannot detect, feathers that reveal identity, surfaces that reflect hidden wavelengths, subtle cues that change with time of day, weather, and angle of light. It is a world that is both familiar and entirely alien. And yet the crow navigates it effortlessly. There is a quiet elegance in this, a reminder that reality is not fixed, but shaped by the senses through which it is experienced. What we call black is not truly black. What we call empty is often filled with structure, and what we fail to see may still be there, influencing everything. For the crow, this expanded perception is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It allows for communication without sound, recognition without contact, awareness that extends beyond the obvious. It is part of what makes the crow so effective, so adaptable, so enduring. Because to survive is not just to exist, it is to understand. And understanding begins with perception. As the crow preens its feathers, aligning each filament with careful precision, it is not merely maintaining its appearance. It is preserving a system of signals, ensuring that its body continues to communicate clearly within its own kind. Every feather matters. Every detail contributes. Even the act of flight becomes something more than movement. As the crow glides through shifting light, its body interacts with the environment in ways that generate information, reflections, shadows, changes in visibility, all of which are processed in real time. The sky is not empty to the crow. It is textured, dynamic, filled with cues. And so, what appears to us as a simple black bird crossing the horizon is, in truth, a being moving through a complex web of light and meaning. A being whose world is richer than ours in ways we are only beginning to understand. As the night deepens further and the boundaries of sight begin to soften, it becomes easier to imagine stepping into that world, just for a moment, to see what the crow sees, to perceive the hidden colors, the silent signals, the layers of reality that exist just beyond human reach. And in that imagined shift, something subtle begins to change. Because once you realize that such a world exists, unseen but ever present, it becomes harder to believe that what we perceive is all there is. The crow knows otherwise. It has always known. And in the quiet darkness, where black is never truly black, its feathers continue to catch the faintest traces of invisible light, telling stories that only its kind can read, waiting for the next moment, the next signal, the next movement in a world far more intricate than it first appears. And as perception deepens, as light itself becomes a language, the story begins to move inward, beyond feather, beyond eye, into something far more elusive. The architecture of thought. Because what allows the crow not only to see, but to understand, is hidden within a structure no larger than a walnut, its brain. At first, this seems almost contradictory. We are conditioned to associate intelligence with size, to imagine that a greater volume must contain greater capacity. And yet the crow quietly dismantles this assumption. Its brain is small, yes, but it is dense, extraordinarily dense. Within that compact space lies a region known as the notopolium, a structure that, in birds, plays a role strikingly similar to the neocortex in mammals. It is here that complex processing occurs, where sensory information is integrated, where decisions are shaped, where something resembling reasoning begins to emerge. What makes this region remarkable is not just its function, but its composition. Neuron for neuron, gram for gram, the crow's brain rivals, and in some cases exceeds, that of primates in terms of neuronal density. This means that within a very small volume, there are an astonishing number of connections, pathways through which information can travel, combine, and transform. Imagine a city, not one that spreads endlessly outward, but one that builds upward, layering complexity within a limited space. Streets crossing over one another, networks intertwining, every pathway optimized for efficiency. That is the crow's brain, compact but intricate. And within that intricacy, something extraordinary takes shape, the ability to model the world. A crow does not simply react to stimuli in the way we might expect from instinct alone. It evaluates, compares, anticipates. It can hold information in working memory, manipulate it, and use it to guide future actions. This is not guesswork. This is cognition. Experiments have revealed moments that feel almost uncanny. A crow presented with a problem it has never encountered before, a puzzle requiring multiple steps, will pause. It will observe. It will test possibilities, sometimes even setting aside immediate impulses in favor of a delayed but more effective strategy. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, where behavior shifts from reaction to consideration, from doing to thinking. And this moment is made possible by the architecture within. Signals flow through the notopolium. Patterns form. Associations strengthen or weaken based on experience. Over time, the crow builds an internal map of cause and effect, a framework that allows it to navigate not just space, but possibility. It begins to understand that actions lead to outcomes, that tools can extend ability, that other beings have intentions. These are not simple realizations. They are foundations of intelligence. And yet, all of this occurs within a brain that, by human standards, seems impossibly small. This is where the elegance of evolution becomes clear. Rather than increasing size indefinitely, the crow lineage refined efficiency. It packed more processing power into less space, reducing the distance signals must travel, increasing the speed at which information can be integrated. Faster processing, denser networks, greater flexibility. A mind built not for brute force, but for precision. And with precision comes subtlety. Consider memory. For a crow, memory is not a static record. It is a living system. Locations of food, faces of allies and threats, patterns of behavior in the environment, all of these are stored, updated, and recalled when needed. But more than that, they are connected. A single experience can link to many others, forming a web of understanding that grows richer over time. This allows the crow to generalize, to apply what it has learned in one context to a completely different situation. A skill that feels almost human. And yet, even here, there is something uniquely avian about the way this intelligence manifests. The crow's mind is not burdened by abstraction in the way ours often is. It remains grounded, closely tied to the immediate world, yet capable of remarkable leaps when necessary. It is a balance between presence and possibility, between instinct and insight. And perhaps this balance is what makes it so effective. Because intelligence, in its purest form, is not about complexity alone. It is about usefulness, the ability to solve problems, to adapt, to survive. And in this, the crow excels. There is also a quiet emotional dimension to this architecture, one that is easy to overlook if we focus only on logic. The same networks that allow for problem solving also support recognition, preference, even something akin to attachment. A crow can remember not just what happened, but who was involved. It can form associations that carry emotional weight, shaping future behavior in ways that suggest more than simple conditioning. It begins to blur the line between instinct and experience, between reaction and relationship. And all of this arises from the dense, intricate networks within that small, dark skull. It is humbling, in a way, to realize that intelligence does not require grandeur, that it can exist in forms we might easily overlook, perched on a branch, watching quietly, processing far more than we assume. As the crow tilts its head, as its eye fixes on something in the distance, there is a sense that it is not merely seeing, it is considering, evaluating, choosing. And within that choice lies the echo of millions of years of refinement. Each generation contributing, each challenge shaping the structure just slightly, guiding it toward greater efficiency, greater capability. Until eventually, it becomes what we see today. A mind that fits within the palm of a hand, yet holds within it a depth that continues to surprise us. As the night grows deeper and thoughts begin to slow, there is something almost meditative about this realization. That intelligence is not exclusive, that it has emerged again and again, in different forms, through different paths, each one shaped by its own history. The crow's path led here, to a brain of remarkable density, to a way of thinking that is both familiar and foreign, to a presence that feels aware. And as we continue to follow this quiet journey, from light into mind, we begin to sense that we are not just observing the crow. We are, in some subtle way, approaching it, drawing closer to an understanding that is not just about biology, but about the nature of thought itself. And in that approach, the boundary between observer and observed becomes just a little softer, a little more permeable, as if in the shared space of awareness, something is beginning to recognize itself in another form. And as that quiet recognition begins to settle, as mind meets mind across the distance between species, the story shifts once more, from thought to perception under pressure. Because seeing clearly in stillness is one thing, but to see clearly in motion, in wind, in storm, that requires something more. A hidden mechanism, a veil that moves when needed and vanishes when not. The crow carries this veil within its eyes, a delicate, translucent membrane known as the nictitating membrane. At first, it is almost impossible to notice. It does not blink in the way human eyelids do, closing down over the eye in darkness. Instead, it moves sideways, gliding smoothly across the surface like a whisper of glass. A third eyelid, thin, nearly invisible, and yet essential. To understand its purpose, imagine flight not as we see it from the ground, graceful, effortless, but as it truly is. Air rushing past its speed. Particles suspended in motion, dust, moisture, fragments of the world carried on invisible currents. Now imagine moving through that space with eyes fully open, unprotected. Every second would be a risk, every gust a potential blindness. And yet, the crow does not close its eyes in flight. It cannot afford to, because to close the eyes, even briefly, is to lose information, to lose awareness. And in the wild, even a fraction of a second can mean the difference between safety and danger. So instead, it uses the membrane. When the wind rises, when rain begins to fall, when the crow dives through branches or descends toward uncertain ground, the membrane slides across the eye, not to block vision, but to soften it, to filter, to protect without obscuring. Light still enters, shapes still form, movement is still tracked, but the harshness is reduced, the impact of particles diminished. It is like looking through a fine veil, a layer that absorbs disturbance while preserving clarity. And then, just as quietly, it withdraws. Gone again, leaving the eye clear, sharp, fully exposed to the world. This constant, subtle movement happens so quickly that it often escapes notice. A flicker, a gliding motion, less than a heartbeat. But within that motion lies a profound adaptation, a solution to a problem that flight itself creates. Because flight is not just freedom, it is exposure to wind, to debris, to unpredictability. And the crow, ever the strategist, meets that exposure with elegance rather than force. The membrane is not thick, not heavy, not obstructive. It does not compromise the crow's ability to see. Instead, it enhances resilience, allowing vision to continue under conditions that would otherwise overwhelm it. And this matters because the crow depends so deeply on sight. We have already begun to understand how rich its visual world is, how layered with information, how sensitive to movement and pattern. To lose that clarity, even momentarily, would be to lose access to that world. So the membrane becomes a guardian, not of the eye alone, but of perception itself. There is something almost poetic in this design, a reminder that protection does not always mean withdrawal, that sometimes the most effective defense is not to close off, but to remain open, with just enough shielding to endure. And perhaps this is why the crow moves through difficult conditions with such composure. In heavy rain, when drops strike like small impacts against feathers and air becomes dense, it continues. The membrane flickers across the eye, again and again, maintaining a softened clarity. The world blurs slightly, but never disappears. In strong wind, when currents shift unpredictably, it adjusts, wings responding instinctively, eyes still scanning, still interpreting. The membrane protects, but does not isolate. Even in moments of conflict, when a crow must defend itself, when another bird lunges or claws reach too close, the membrane becomes a shield. A final layer between the fragile surface of the eye and sudden harm. All of this, contained within a structure so thin it is nearly invisible. It is easy to overlook such things, to focus instead on the more obvious traits, the feathers, the voice, the intelligence that reveals itself in behavior. But here, in this quiet mechanism, we see another aspect of what makes the crow what it is. Not just clever, not just adaptable, but refined. Every part of its body shaped by the demands of its environment, every system tuned to support its way of being in the world. And as we begin to notice these details, something shifts again in our understanding. Because the crow is no longer just an observer of its surroundings. It is a participant, fully engaged, equipped to remain aware even when conditions become difficult. There is a subtle parallel here, one that becomes clearer in the stillness of night. We, too, move through moments when the world feels overwhelming, when clarity fades, when too much arrives at once. And often, our instinct is to close off, to retreat entirely, to shut our eyes to the noise. But the crow offers a different image, not of retreat, but of filtering, of remaining present while softening the impact, of continuing to see, even when conditions are less than ideal. And perhaps this is part of what draws us to them, even if we do not always realize it. They embody a kind of quiet resilience, a way of moving through the world that balances openness with protection, awareness with endurance. As the crow glides through the dimming light, its wings cutting smoothly through the air, its eyes alert behind that nearly invisible veil, it carries with it a system perfected over millions of years, a system that allows it to remain connected, to remain aware, to remain capable, even in motion, even in uncertainty. And as the night settles more deeply and the boundaries between thought and image begin to blur, we are left with a simple, steady impression that nothing in the crow is accidental, that every detail, no matter how small, contributes to a larger harmony, a harmony that allows it not just to survive, but to navigate the world with a clarity that persists, even when the winds rise, even when the rain begins, even when the path ahead is not entirely clear. And so it continues, eyes open, perception intact, moving forward into whatever comes next, with a quiet certainty that feels almost unshakable. And so with vision protected and mind alert, the crow steps into a different kind of mastery, not just seeing the world, not just understanding it, but reshaping it. Because there comes a moment in the evolution of intelligence when observation is no longer enough, a moment when the environment is no longer simply accepted, but quietly altered. And in that moment, a new kind of being emerges, a maker. Among the many branches of the crow family, there is one in particular that reveals this shift with striking clarity, the New Caledonian crow. On a cluster of islands in the South Pacific, far from the noise of cities and the familiar patterns of human life, these crows have developed a behavior that feels almost deliberate in its precision. They create tools, not by accident, not by simple repetition, but through a process that suggests intention. Imagine a slender branch, unremarkable at first glance. To most creatures, it is nothing more than part of the landscape. But to this crow, it is possibility. The crow selects it carefully, testing its flexibility, its shape, its strength. Then, with measured movements of its beak, it begins to alter it. A bend here, a pull there, a small adjustment, then another. Until the branch is no longer just a branch, it becomes a hook, a tool designed for a purpose. And that purpose is often hidden, just out of reach. Insects buried within crevices, grubs concealed beneath bark, food that cannot be accessed by beak alone. The crow inserts the tool, maneuvers it with subtle control, and draws the hidden prize into the open. This is not instinct in its simplest form, because the exact shape of the tool, the angle of the hook, the method of use can vary. Individual crows refine their techniques over time. They learn from success, adjust after failure, sometimes even improve upon what they have done before. There is a feedback loop here. Action, result, adjustment, a quiet cycle of innovation. What makes this even more remarkable is that young crows do not emerge into the world already knowing how to do this perfectly. They observe, they experiment, they practice. There are moments of clumsiness, of dropped tools, of attempts that do not succeed, but gradually, through repetition and attention, skill emerges. And once it does, it remains. The crow remembers. It carries that knowledge forward, applying it again when needed, refining it further over time. This is the beginning of something profound. Because tool use changes the relationship between an organism and its environment. No longer limited by the body alone, the crow extends itself outward. The tool becomes an extension of its beak, its reach, its ability to interact with the world. And in doing so, the crow steps into a new dimension of control. It is no longer just adapting to the environment, it is shaping it. There is a quiet elegance in the way this happens. No grand gestures, no dramatic transformations, just small, deliberate actions, repeated over time, leading to outcomes that would otherwise be impossible. A hidden insect becomes accessible, a barrier becomes negotiable, a problem becomes solvable. And perhaps most fascinating of all, this ability is not confined to a single rigid behavior. New Caledonian crows have been observed modifying tools in different ways depending on the situation. Sometimes they create simple sticks. Other times they craft more complex hooked shapes. In certain cases, they even use one tool to obtain another, a sequence of actions that suggests planning beyond the immediate moment. A tool to get a tool. A step toward a goal that is not yet visible. This kind of thinking, layered, sequential, reveals something deeper than simple trial and error. It suggests foresight, an awareness that actions taken now can influence outcomes later. And within that awareness, we begin to glimpse a mind that is not just reactive, but proactive, a mind that can imagine. It is easy to underestimate this, to see it as a curious behavior limited to a distant island. But in truth, it reflects a capacity that runs through the crow lineage more broadly, an ability to engage with the world creatively, to see objects not only for what they are, but for what they could become. A stick is not just a stick. A leaf is not just a leaf. Each holds potential, waiting to be unlocked through interaction. And this way of seeing, this openness to possibility, is at the heart of innovation. Even beyond New Caledonia, other crows demonstrate simpler forms of tool use, dropping nuts onto hard surfaces to crack them, using objects to probe, manipulating their surroundings in subtle but meaningful ways. Each act is a small expression of the same underlying principle, that the boundary between self and environment is not fixed. It can be bridged, extended, transformed. As the crow grips its crafted tool, holding it with precision, adjusting its position with minute movements, there is a sense of intention that is difficult to ignore. It is not rushing. It is not acting blindly. It is engaged, focused, present in the act of creation and use. And in that presence, something quietly remarkable unfolds, a dialogue between mind and matter, between idea and execution. The tool begins as a possibility, a faint recognition that something could be different. Then, through action, that possibility becomes real. And once real, it feeds back into the mind, reinforcing the understanding that change is possible, that problems can be solved, that the world is not entirely fixed. For a creature navigating a complex and often unpredictable environment, this realization is powerful. It opens doors, creates opportunities, enhances survival in ways that pure instinct cannot. And yet, there is no arrogance in the crow's behavior, no excess, no unnecessary complexity. The tool is made only when needed, used efficiently, then often discarded. There is a simplicity to it, a directness. The crow does not create for the sake of creation. It creates for purpose. And perhaps this is another lesson, quietly embedded within its actions. That intelligence does not always seek to dominate or transform everything around it. Sometimes, it simply finds the most elegant way through. As the crow finishes its task, extracting what was hidden, it releases the tool, allowing it to fall back into the environment from which it came. The branch returns to being a branch. The moment passes, but the knowledge remains, carried within the dense networks of its mind, ready to be called upon again. And as the night continues to unfold, as the air cools and the world settles into a slower rhythm, we begin to sense that this act of creation is not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of a larger pattern. A pattern in which the crow, again and again, meets the challenges of its world, not with force, but with ingenuity. Not with rigidity, but with flexibility. And in that flexibility, it finds a path forward. A path that winds quietly through forests and cities alike, shaped not by what is given, but by what can be made. And so, with a simple hook carved from a branch, the crow reveals something profound. That even in a world shaped by ancient forces, where survival has always been uncertain, there is room for invention, room for thought to take form, room for a mind to leave its mark upon the world. And from that quiet act of shaping the world, the crow moves, almost seamlessly, into something even more subtle. Not just creating tools, but understanding forces that cannot be seen. Forces that act silently, yet with perfect consistency. There is an old story, one that has traveled across centuries, whispered from one culture to another. A thirsty crow finds a vessel, a narrow container with water resting just beyond the reach of its beak. Unable to drink, it begins to drop stones into the vessel, one by one, until the water rises high enough to be reached. It is often told as a simple fable, a lesson about cleverness. But what happens when that story is brought into the quiet precision of a laboratory, when it is no longer a tale, but a test? Researchers have done exactly this. They present crows with transparent tubes partially filled with water, with floating food just out of reach. Nearby, objects of different shapes, sizes, and weights. The crow observes, pauses, then begins. A stone is picked up, dropped into the tube. The water level rises slightly. Another stone, another small rise, again and again, until the food is within reach. At first glance, this seems like repetition, but then something more revealing begins to emerge. When given a choice between objects, the crow selects those that are heavier, those that will sink rather than float. It ignores items that would be ineffective, even if they are similar in appearance. When presented with tubes of different widths, it adjusts its behavior. Narrow tubes require fewer stones to raise the water. Wide tubes require more. The crow learns this, adapts, optimizes. There is a pattern here, not just action, but selection. Not just repetition, but understanding. At the heart of this behavior lies a principle that humans describe through the Archimedes principle, the idea that an object submerged in a fluid displaces a volume equal to its own, causing the fluid level to rise. It is a principle rooted in physics, but the crow does not know it as a formula. It knows it through experience, through interaction, through the quiet accumulation of cause and effect. A stone sinks, water rises. A floating object does nothing. A larger stone produces a greater change. These observations, repeated and refined, form an internal model of how the world behaves. And once that model exists, it can be used. This is the subtle leap, from noticing to predicting. The crow is not simply reacting to what happens after each stone is dropped. In many cases, it appears to anticipate the outcome, choosing objects that will be effective before the result is seen. There is a moment, just before the action, where a decision is made, a silent calculation. And within that moment, we begin to sense something extraordinary, an intuitive grasp of physical reality. Not in words, not in symbols, but in patterns that guide behavior with quiet precision. It is easy to imagine intelligence as something that requires language, equations, formal reasoning. But here, in the stillness of this experiment, we see another form, a form that emerges directly from interaction with the world. The crow does not need to articulate the concept of displacement. It embodies it, and this embodiment allows it to solve problems that would otherwise remain inaccessible. There are variations of this test that reveal even deeper layers. In some cases, crows are presented with tubes filled not with water, but with materials like sand or gel. Dropping stones into these does not produce the same effect. At first, the crow may attempt the familiar action, dropping a stone as it has learned to do. But when the expected result does not occur, when the food does not rise, something shifts. The crow pauses, reassesses, and often it stops. It does not continue endlessly repeating an ineffective action. Instead, it abandons the strategy, seeking alternatives. This ability to recognize failure and adjust accordingly is as important as success, because it reveals flexibility, a willingness to update understanding based on new information, a mind that is not locked into a single pattern but open to change. There is a quiet intelligence in this restraint, in knowing when not to continue, in sensing that a familiar solution no longer applies. And perhaps this is one of the most profound aspects of the crow's cognition. Not just the ability to solve problems, but the ability to know when a problem requires a different approach. As the crow stands beside the tube, the surface of the water reflecting faint light, there is a stillness that feels almost contemplative. It is not rushed, not frantic. Each action is deliberate, each choice informed by something deeper than impulse. And in that deliberation, the boundary between instinct and reasoning becomes increasingly difficult to define. Because what we are witnessing is not a simple chain of reactions. It is a process, a sequence guided by internal representation, by memory, by expectation. A mind engaging with the invisible. Water itself is invisible in its forces. We see its surface, its movement, but not the principles that govern it. And yet the crow interacts with those principles as if it understands them. Not abstractly, but practically, functionally, in a way that allows it to achieve its goal. And this is, in many ways, the essence of intelligence. To act effectively in a world whose rules are not directly visible, to infer, to test, to adapt. The ancient fable becomes something more in this light, not just a story of cleverness, but a reflection of a real capacity, one that has evolved quietly, without language, without formal teaching. A capacity that emerges from the interplay between mind and environment. As the crow finally reaches the floating food, as its beak touches the surface and lifts the reward, there is no celebration, no pause to reflect on the success. It simply continues. Because for the crow, this is not remarkable. It is natural, a part of how it moves through the world. And yet, for those who observe, there is a sense of wonder that lingers. A realization that intelligence can take many forms, that understanding does not always require words, that the principles we describe in textbooks may also live, quietly, within the actions of another being. As the scene fades into the soft rhythm of night, the image of the crow beside the water remains, a small figure, engaged in a task that bridges story and science, instinct and insight. And in that image, something shifts once more. Because we begin to see that the crow is not just interacting with objects, it is interacting with laws, with the hidden structure of reality itself, and doing so with a calm precision that feels almost timeless. As if, in its own way, it has always known how the world works. Not through explanation, but through experience. And in that experience, it finds its way, again and again, through challenges that would stop others. Guided by an understanding that flows as quietly and as powerfully as water itself. And from the quiet understanding of water and weight, the crow steps into a world shaped not only by nature, but by us. A world of straight lines and sharp edges, of movement governed not by instinct, but by machines. The city. At first, it might seem like an unlikely habitat. Noise layered upon noise, surfaces that do not yield, rhythms that change not with the sun or the seasons, but with signals, with human intention. And yet, the crow does not retreat from this world. It studies it, learns its patterns, finds within it new opportunities. There is a particular scene, repeated in cities across the globe, subtle enough that many pass by without noticing. A crow stands at the edge of a road, something small held in its beak, a nut perhaps, still sealed within its hard shell. Nearby, vehicles move in steady streams. To most creatures, this would be a place of danger, something to avoid. But the crow does not flee. It watches. The flow of traffic, the intervals, the pauses. And then, at a moment that seems carefully chosen, it moves. The nut is placed on the road, not randomly, but with intention, positioned where the tires of passing cars will cross. Then the crow retreats, lifting into the air or stepping back to the safety of the curb. It waits. A car approaches, passes over the nut, and continues on. The shell cracks, sometimes not completely, sometimes requiring more than one pass. And so the crow waits again, allowing the process to repeat until the shell yields. Only then does it return, descending quickly, retrieving the exposed contents, and moving away before the flow resumes. This behavior has been observed in multiple locations among different crow populations. And what makes it remarkable is not just the use of the car as a tool, but the timing. Because timing here is everything. In some cities, crows have been seen placing nuts specifically at pedestrian crossings, where traffic lights control the movement of vehicles. They wait for the red signal when cars come to a stop and use that moment to safely retrieve the food. When the light changes, they withdraw again. There is an awareness here, not just of objects, but of systems. The crow is not merely reacting to individual cars. It is responding to patterns, to rhythms that repeat over time. It learns the sequence, the intervals, the safe moments within the flow. It understands, in its own way, the structure of this human-made environment. This is not something encoded in instinct. There was no ancient forest where crows learned about traffic lights, no evolutionary pressure that shaped this exact behavior over millions of years. This is adaptation in real time. Learning, observation, integration, a mind encountering a new world and finding within it a way to thrive. There is a quiet boldness in this, to approach something as foreign as a busy road, not with fear alone, but with curiosity, to test, to observe, to gradually build an understanding of how it works, and then to use it. The car becomes more than a machine. It becomes a tool, an extension of the crow's problem-solving ability, much like the hooked branch, much like the stone dropped into water. Only now, the scale is larger, the forces are greater, and the stakes more immediate. Because unlike a branch or a stone, a car does not wait, it does not adjust. It moves with its own momentum, its own purpose. And yet, the crow finds a way to align with that movement, to anticipate it, to position itself within it without being harmed. This requires precision, attention, a continuous awareness of risk and timing, and within that awareness, a kind of intelligence that is deeply attuned to change. The city is not static. Traffic patterns shift, human behavior varies, conditions evolve, but the crow adapts alongside them. It learns which roads are too dangerous, which intersections provide opportunities, which times of day offer the best balance between risk and reward. It remembers, and it shares. Because crows do not exist in isolation. They observe one another, learn from one another, sometimes even imitate behaviors that prove successful. A single innovation can ripple outward, becoming part of a broader pattern within a group, a kind of cultural transmission. Not written, not spoken in words, but carried through observation and repetition. In this way, the city becomes not just a habitat, but a classroom, a place where new behaviors emerge, are tested, and if successful, become part of the crow's evolving repertoire. There is something almost poetic in this relationship. Humans build cities, shaping environments for their own needs, often unaware of how those environments might be perceived by other species. And then, quietly, the crow steps in. Not as a passive inhabitant, but as an active participant. Reading the patterns we create, finding within them opportunities we did not intend. A partnership of sorts. Unspoken, unplanned, and yet undeniably real. As the crow lifts into the air above the street, carrying its hard-won reward, there is a sense that it has navigated not just space, but complexity. That it has moved through a system of motion and timing and emerged with success. And all of this without instruction. Without guidance, only through the steady accumulation of experience, trial, observation, adjustment. The same quiet processes that shaped its ancestors through ancient landscapes now applied to asphalt and steel. And so the story continues. From forests to cities, from branches to traffic lights, the crow remains what it has always been. An observer, a learner, an adapter, but also something more, a being capable of finding order within chaos, of aligning itself with forces far larger than its own body, and using them with precision. As the night settles over the city and the hum of traffic softens into a distant rhythm, the image lingers, A dark figure at the edge of a crosswalk, waiting, watching the light, timing the moment. And in that stillness, there is a quiet intelligence at work, one that bridges the natural and the artificial, the ancient and the modern. A mind that has learned not just to survive the world, but to read it. And in reading it, to find its place within even the most unexpected landscapes. And as the crow learns to read the movements of machines, to follow rhythms written in light and motion, its attention turns, inevitably, to something far more complex. Not roads, not objects, but faces. Among all the patterns in the world, few are as rich, as unpredictable as the human face. Subtle shifts in expression, changes in posture, the smallest movements of the eyes or mouth, all carrying meaning, intention, emotion. For many animals, these details pass unnoticed, but not for the crow, because the crow does not merely see a face, it remembers it. There have been careful studies, quiet experiments carried out over long stretches of time. In one such study, researchers from the University of Washington wore distinct masks while interacting with wild crows. Some masks were associated with threat, the capture and handling of birds. Others were neutral, harmless, passive. At first, the crows reacted in the moment. Alarm calls, avoidance, agitation. But what happened next is what revealed something deeper. Days passed, weeks, even years. And still, when the threatening mask appeared again, the crows responded. They gathered, they called out, they warned others. The reaction was not random, not generalized. It was specific, targeted, directed toward a particular face. This alone would be remarkable. But the story does not end there, because the crows that had never directly experienced the initial event, younger birds, or those who arrived later, also began to respond to that same mask. They learned, not through direct encounter, but through observation, through the behavior of others. A kind of social memory spreading across individuals, across time. The face became more than an image, it became a signal, a marker of danger embedded within the group. And this signal could persist for years, carried forward even as individual birds came and went. There is something quietly unsettling in this, to realize that a crow may look at you, not just as a passing figure, but as an identity, that it may categorize you, remember you, place you within a network of meaning that extends beyond a single moment. Friend, threat, neutral. These distinctions are not made lightly. They are built through experience, reinforced through repetition, and once formed, they are not easily forgotten. The crow's brain, with its dense networks and powerful associative memory, holds on to these impressions with remarkable clarity, and perhaps even more striking, it can update them. A face that once signaled danger may over time come to be seen differently if the pattern of interaction changes. Repeated neutral or positive encounters can soften the response, reshape the association. In this way, the crow's perception of others is not fixed. It evolves, just as its understanding of objects, of systems, of environments evolves. Everything is subject to learning. Everything can be reinterpreted. There is a depth here that goes beyond simple recognition. It suggests something closer to evaluation, a process in which the crow does not just store an image, but attaches meaning to it, integrates it into a broader framework of understanding. And within that framework, behavior is guided. Approach, avoid, alert others, remain calm, each response shaped by the history carried within the mind. It is easy to imagine memory as something passive, a record of what has been. But for the crow, memory is active. It influences the present, shapes decisions, alters interactions in real time. When a crow spots a familiar face, there is a moment, brief but significant, where recognition occurs. And in that moment, the past flows into the present, informing what happens next. There is no need for language, no need for conscious reflection as we understand it. The system operates quietly, efficiently, beneath the surface, and yet its effects are visible. In the sudden call that spreads through a group, in the coordinated movement of multiple birds reacting to a shared signal, in the subtle shift of behavior when a known individual enters the scene. This is not randomness, it is structure. A network of memory and communication that extends beyond any single crow, because once a face is recognized, it can be shared. Through calls, through behavior, through repeated exposure. The knowledge becomes collective, a distributed awareness held within the group. And in this way, the crow community develops something that begins to resemble culture. Not in the human sense, with symbols and stories, but in a more fundamental form, shared knowledge, passed on through observation, sustained across time. There is a quiet power in this, because it means that the crow's understanding of the world is not limited to individual experience. It can grow, accumulate, expand beyond the lifespan of any one bird. A young crow entering a territory does not begin from nothing. It inherits patterns, signals, tendencies shaped by those who came before. It learns who to trust, who to avoid, where to find food, where danger lies, all through the subtle language of behavior, and faces remain at the center of this system. They are anchors, points of reference in a shifting world. As the crow watches from its perch, its gaze steady. There is a sense that it is not merely observing the present moment. It is comparing, matching what it sees now with what it has seen before. And in that comparison, meaning emerges. This ability to recognize and remember individuals, to categorize them, to adjust behavior accordingly, places the crow in a rare category among animals, a category where social complexity begins to intertwine with cognition, where relationships are not just immediate, but extended through memory, where interactions leave lasting impressions. And perhaps this is why encounters with crows can feel different. There is often a sense, subtle but persistent, that you are being watched not just as a moving object, but as a presence, as someone. It is not imagination, it is recognition. And once that recognition exists, it does not easily fade. As the night deepens and the world grows quieter, this idea lingers, that somewhere, in the branches above or the edges of the city, there may be a pair of eyes that remembers, that has seen before and will see again, that carries within it a map of faces, of experiences, of meanings that extend far beyond a single encounter. And in that quiet awareness, the crow continues to watch, not passively, but with a memory that reaches backward, and a perception that shapes what comes next, a mind that does not forget easily, a presence that learns who you are, and in its own way decides what that means. And as memory stretches across faces, across time, the story deepens into something quieter, something that unfolds in the presence of absence. Because there are moments in the life of a crow when the world stops, not in stillness, but in attention. A fallen crow lies on the ground, feathers unmoving, wings folded in a way that no longer suggests flight. Around it, the air shifts. One crow arrives, then another, then more. They gather, not in chaos, but in a kind of uneasy order. They do not touch the body at first. They circle, perch nearby, call out in tones that differ from their usual sounds. The calls are sharper, more insistent, carrying across distance as if summoning others. And others come. What follows has often been described in human terms as a funeral. But this word, while evocative, does not fully capture what is happening. Because the crows are not mourning in the way we understand it. They are learning. The gathering is not random. It is focused, directed toward the presence of death. Each crow observes, studies, takes in the details of the scene, the position of the body, the surrounding environment, any signs of disturbance. If a predator is nearby, if a threat lingers, this is the moment to detect it, to understand, to remember. The fallen crow becomes a signal, a point of information in the landscape, and the gathering becomes a collective act of attention. There is a tension in the air, a heightened awareness that spreads through the group. Wings shift, heads tilt, eyes fix on the same focal point. The usual rhythm of foraging or movement pauses, replaced by something more deliberate. An investigation. Researchers who have observed this behavior have noted that crows exposed to such gatherings become more cautious afterward. They avoid locations associated with the event. They respond more quickly to potential threats. They carry forward what they have learned. The encounter with death changes them. Not abstractly, not philosophically, but practically. It alters behavior, enhances survival. And this is where the meaning of the gathering begins to emerge. It is not ritual for its own sake. It is information processing. A moment when the group comes together to interpret a critical event, to extract meaning from loss, to transform it into knowledge. There is something deeply resonant in this, because it reveals a relationship with death that is neither indifferent nor sentimental, but attentive, engaged. The crow does not ignore the fallen, nor does it remain trapped in the moment. It observes, learns, and moves forward with a changed understanding. And yet, there are moments within these gatherings that feel difficult to explain purely in terms of function. A crow standing near the body, silent, still. for longer than necessary. Another letting out a low, subdued call, different from the sharper alarms. The group lingering, even after the immediate threat has passed. These details suggest that something more may be present. Not necessarily emotion as we define it, but a state of heightened awareness that carries a weight beyond simple reaction. A recognition that something has ended, that a presence is no longer there. And in that recognition, a pause, a shift in the usual flow of activity. It is in these moments that the boundary between behavior and experience becomes less clear. Because while the primary function may be learning, the process itself is not devoid of feeling. The crow's brain, capable of memory, association, and social awareness, does not simply register events. It integrates them. A fallen companion is not just a data point. It is part of a network of relationships, of interactions that have occurred over time. And when that network changes, when one element is removed, the system adjusts. Perhaps this adjustment carries with it a subtle internal shift, something that resembles what we might call awareness of loss. Not articulated, not reflected upon in words, but present, in the pause, in the attention, in the way the group gathers and remains for a time. Then, gradually, the moment passes. One by one, the crows begin to disperse. The calls soften, the tension eases, movement resumes. The world continues, but not unchanged. Each crow carries away something from the encounter, a memory, a heightened sensitivity, an updated map of risk. And within the group, that knowledge spreads, through calls, through behavior, through subtle cues that others can read. In this way, the event becomes more than a single moment. It becomes part of a larger pattern, influencing future actions, shaping the way the crows navigate their environment. There is a quiet continuity here. Life, observation. Death, learning, adaptation. A cycle that repeats, not with dramatic gestures, but with steady, deliberate attention. And within that cycle, the crow maintains its place, not as a passive participant, but as an active interpreter of events. As the night deepens further and the world grows still, the image lingers. A group of dark figures gathered around a silent form, not in confusion, not in panic, but in focus, in presence. It is a scene that invites reflection, not because it mirrors human rituals exactly, but because it reveals a shared thread, a way of responding to the end of life that involves attention, learning, and a quiet acknowledgement of change. The crow does not turn away. It looks, and in looking, it understands just enough to continue, to move forward with greater awareness, greater caution, greater sensitivity to the world it inhabits. There is no final conclusion in this moment, no resolution, only the steady continuation of life, informed by what has been seen. And perhaps that is enough. As the last crow lifts into the darkened sky, leaving the still form behind, the air returns to its usual silence. But something has shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but within the minds of those who were present, a new layer of understanding has formed. A quiet imprint, carried forward into the next day, the next decision, the next encounter with the unknown. And so the story continues, shaped not only by what is gained, but also by what is lost. Each moment leaving its trace, each observation adding to the delicate, evolving map of survival. A map written not in words, but in attention. And from that quiet attention to endings, the story turns gently towards something that endures. Not just survival, not just learning, but connection. Because within the shifting patterns of the crow's life, there are bonds that hold steady, pairs that form, not for a season, but for years, often for life. A crow does not rush into this bond. It emerges gradually, through proximity, through shared moments, through a subtle alignment of behavior that deepens over time. Two individuals begin to move together more often, to perch near one another, to respond to the same signals. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a partnership forms. Once formed, it is remarkably stable. The pair remains together across seasons, across migrations of food and weather, through the cycles of nesting and rest. They learn one another's rhythms, anticipate movements, coordinate without the need for constant signals. There is a quiet efficiency in this, but also something more. Because this partnership is not purely functional, it is maintained through small, repeated acts, gestures that reinforce the bond. One of the most intimate of these is allopreening, the gentle grooming of feathers. A crow will use its beak to clean and align the feathers of its partner, reaching areas that the other cannot easily access. The motion is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Feather by feather, the structure is restored. The intricate network of barbs and barbules brought back into alignment. But beyond the physical benefit, there is a deeper effect. Trust. To allow another so close to remain still as delicate movements pass over the body requires a sense of safety. And in that stillness, the bond is strengthened. There is no urgency here, no display meant for others, just two beings engaged in a quiet exchange that maintains both form and connection. Over time, these moments accumulate. They become part of the fabric of the relationship, threads woven through daily life. And when the season turns, when the time comes to build, this partnership reveals another dimension. Together, the pair begins to construct a nest. High in the branches, often in a place that offers both shelter and visibility, they gather materials. Twigs, small branches, fibers, anything that can be shaped into structure. One brings, the other arranges. Then roles shift, back and forth, in a rhythm that feels almost practiced. The outer layers are built first, a rough framework of stronger sticks, interlocked to create stability. Within this frame, softer materials are added, forming a lining that will cradle what comes next. The nest is not random. It is designed, shaped by instinct, yes, but also refined through experience. Each season offers the opportunity to improve, to adjust placement, to select better materials, to respond to what worked and what did not. And always, the work is shared. There is a kind of quiet communication in this process. No elaborate signals, no visible negotiation, yet coordination emerges. A twig is placed, adjusted, secured. Another follows. The structure grows, and within it, a space is created, a small, protected world suspended above the ground. When the eggs arrive, the rhythm changes again. The female often takes on the primary role of incubation, remaining within the nest, keeping the eggs warm, maintaining the precise conditions needed for life to develop. The male, in turn, becomes a provider. He brings food, returning again and again, ensuring that his partner can remain in place undisturbed. This division is not rigid, but it is reliable. Each fulfills a role that supports the other. And in this mutual support, the bond deepens further. There is a constancy here, a steady presence that persists through the vulnerable early stages of life. The world beyond the nest continues to shift. Predators move, weather changes, resources fluctuate. But within the partnership, there is continuity, a shared commitment to what has been created. As the eggs begin to hatch, the quiet stillness gives way to movement. Small, fragile forms emerge, entirely dependent, their needs immediate and constant. And once again, the pair adapts. Feeding becomes frequent, almost continuous. Trips back and forth, carrying insects, scraps, whatever can be found. The demands are high, the pace unrelenting. But the work is not born alone. Both parents participate. They respond to the calls, the open beaks, the subtle signals of hunger and discomfort. They remove waste, maintain the nest, protect against intrusion. Each action, part of a larger system of care. And within the system, something quietly remarkable unfolds. Because while the primary focus is survival, there are moments that suggest something more. A parent lingering just slightly longer than necessary, adjusting position, responding not just to need, but to presence. The chicks, in turn, begin to recognize, to associate, to respond differently to each parent, to the patterns of care they receive. And over time, as feathers grow, as strength builds, independence begins to emerge. The young crows move within the nest, then to its edges, then beyond. Short flights, tentative at first, then more confident. And throughout this transition, the pair remains, watching, guiding, not through direct instruction, but through example, through presence. The partnership that began in quiet alignment now extends outward, shaping the next generation, passing on not just genes, but patterns, behaviors, ways of interacting with the world. And when the young finally leave, when they no longer return to the nest, the bond between the pair does not dissolve. It continues, through changing seasons, through new cycles of building and raising, through the quiet passage of time. There is a resilience in this, a stability that exists within a world of constant change. And perhaps this is part of what makes the crow's life feel so balanced. Amidst intelligence, adaptability, complexity, there is also continuity, a thread that runs through it all. Connection. As the night settles deeper and the branches sway gently in the dark, the image forms once more. Two crows, side by side, feathers aligned, bodies still. No urgency, no need for movement, just presence. And in that presence, a bond that has been built slowly, maintained carefully, and carried forward with quiet consistency. A partnership not defined by grand gestures, but by countless small acts, repeated over time. Acts that together create something enduring, something that holds, even as the world shifts around it. And so, within the kingdom of shadow and feather, there exists not only survival, not only intelligence, but also a form of devotion, unspoken, unadorned, but unmistakably real. And from that steady partnership, from the quiet rhythm of two becoming one, the story opens outward again into something unexpected. Because not every young crow leaves, not immediately, not completely. There are some who remain, lingering at the edges of the nest long after their wings are strong, long after they are capable of surviving on their own. They do not stay out of weakness, nor out of hesitation. They stay by choice. These are the helpers. Young crows, often from the previous brood, who remain within the territory of their parents, participating in the care of the next generation. They forage, they watch for danger, they bring food, sometimes even feeding the new chicks directly. At first, this behavior seems almost paradoxical. In a world where survival is uncertain, where resources must be earned, why would a capable individual delay its own independence? Why invest time and energy into raising siblings, instead of pursuing its own path? The answer unfolds slowly, layered with both practicality and something deeper. On the surface, there are clear advantages. A young crow that remains within a familiar territory benefits from protection. The parents, experienced and alert, maintain awareness of threats. The territory itself, already established, offers known sources of food, known places of shelter. To leave too early, to venture into unfamiliar ground, carries risk, competition, uncertainty. But staying is not merely about safety, it is about learning. Because within the family group, the young crow continues to observe, to refine its understanding of the world. It watches how the parents respond to danger, how they locate food, how they interact with others. It learns timing, nuance, the subtle decisions that cannot be taught directly, but must be absorbed through experience. And as it learns, it contributes. The act of helping becomes a form of practice, a rehearsal for the future. Feeding a chick is not just an act of support, it is an act of preparation. The young crow begins to understand the rhythms of care, the needs of developing life, the balance between urgency and patience. It experiences in advance what it will one day carry out on its own. There is a quiet efficiency in this system. Knowledge is not passed through instruction, but through participation, through doing. And because of this, the transition to independence, when it finally comes, is smoother, more assured. But beyond practicality, there is another layer to consider, a relational one. The young crow is not an isolated individual. It exists within a network, a family, a group whose members recognize one another, remember one another, respond to one another. To remain is not just to stay in a place. It is to stay within a relationship, to continue a connection that has already been formed. And within that connection, there is a subtle reciprocity. The parents once invested in the young, providing care, protection, nourishment. Now the young returns a portion of that investment, not as repayment in a human sense, but as a continuation of the bond. A cycle, care giving way to care, support giving way to support. This pattern, known in the natural world as cooperative breeding, appears in only a small number of species. It requires a level of social complexity, of recognition, of memory, that not all animals possess. But the crow, with its dense, capable mind, with its ability to form lasting associations, fits naturally into this pattern. It understands in its own way that its actions are connected to others, that the well-being of the group influences its own future. And so it acts, not just for itself, but within a broader context. There are moments, quiet and easily overlooked, where this dynamic becomes visible. A young crow perched near the nest, alert, watching the surroundings while the parents forage. Another returning with a small piece of food, offering it to a waiting chick. The parents, momentarily relieved of a task, able to rest, to preen, to regain energy. These moments are not dramatic. They do not draw attention. But they reveal a system that is both efficient and deeply interconnected. A system where roles are fluid, where responsibility can be shared, where the burden of survival is distributed. And within this system, the young crow grows. Not just in strength, but in understanding. Because to care for another, even in small ways, changes perception. It shifts attention outward, encourages awareness of needs beyond one's own, refines the ability to respond appropriately. These are subtle skills, but powerful ones. They shape behavior, influence decisions, and, over time, contribute to the overall success of the individual. Eventually, the moment comes. The young crow leaves. Not abruptly, not as a sudden break, but as a gradual transition. It begins to spend more time away, to explore, to establish its own patterns. The familiar territory recedes, new spaces emerge, and with them, new challenges. But the crow does not leave empty-handed. It carries with it everything it has absorbed, the memory of care, the experience of helping, the patterns of interaction that have been practiced and refined. All of these become part of its internal map, guiding its actions as it steps into independence. And when, in time, it forms its own partnership, builds its own nest, raises its own young, those patterns reappear, not as copies, but as continuations, adapted to new circumstances, shaped by new experiences, but rooted in what came before. There is a quiet continuity here, a thread that passes from one generation to the next, not through instruction, but through living, through shared time, shared space, shared effort. And in this continuity, the crow lineage maintains not just survival, but coherence, a sense of connection that extends beyond the individual. As the night deepens and the world settles into its slow rhythm, the image lingers once more. A small group of crows, moving together, not in perfect unison, but in subtle coordination. Each aware of the others, each responding in ways that reflect both independence and connection. And within that movement, there is something quietly profound. A reminder that intelligence is not only about solving problems or navigating environments, but also about relationships, about the ability to exist within a network of others, to give, to receive, to adjust, to remain. And so the story continues, carried not just by individuals, but by bonds, by the quiet decision, again and again, to stay a little longer, to help a little more, to be part of something that extends beyond the self. A pattern as old as life itself, unfolding in the dark feathers of the crow, one small act at a time. And from that web of care, from bonds that stretch across seasons and generations, the story softens again and begins to move with the wind. Because there are moments in a crow's life that are not about survival, not about food or danger or even responsibility. Moments that seem unnecessary, and yet they appear again and again. A crow stands on the edge of a sloped roof, the surface dusted lightly with snow or rain. It leans forward, wings slightly spread, and then, without urgency, it lets itself glide downward. A short slide, a soft landing. Then it climbs back up and does it again. Elsewhere, a crow hangs upside down from a branch, gripping with its feet, body suspended, wings loose at its sides. It sways gently, then flaps once, releasing, catching itself in the air before settling again. In open sky, a pair of crows chase one another, not in aggression, not in pursuit of food, but in looping arcs, diving and rising, mirroring each other's movements with a fluid grace that feels almost joyful. These behaviors have a name in the quiet language of science. They are called play behavior. But naming them does not fully explain them, because play by its nature resists simple definition. It is not strictly necessary for immediate survival. It does not produce food or directly avoid danger, and yet it persists across species, across environments, wherever intelligence reaches a certain threshold. And in the crow, it appears with a clarity that is difficult to ignore. Young crows play often, as many young animals do. They explore objects, manipulate them, toss them into the air, and catch them again. They engage with one another, testing boundaries, learning the subtle rules of interaction. But what is striking is that adult crows also play. Long after the urgent lessons of youth have been learned, long after survival strategies are well established, they continue, sliding, swinging, chasing, interacting with the world in ways that seem exploratory, unconstrained. There is something quietly revealing in this, because play requires a certain kind of mind, a mind that is not entirely consumed by immediate needs, a mind that has enough flexibility, enough surplus capacity to engage in actions that are not strictly goal-oriented. In other words, a mind that can afford to be curious. Curiosity is at the heart of play, the willingness to engage with something simply to see what happens, to test, to experiment, without a fixed outcome in mind. And through this process, something subtle occurs. Skills are refined, Coordination improves, social bonds are strengthened. But perhaps more importantly, the mind becomes more adaptable. Play introduces variability, unpredictability. It allows the crow to encounter situations that are not part of its usual routine, to respond in new ways, to expand its behavioral repertoire. A crow that plays is a crow that practices, not just specific actions, but flexibility itself. And flexibility, as we have seen, is one of the crow's greatest strengths. There is also a social dimension to this behavior. When crows play together, they engage in a kind of dialogue, not through words, but through movement. One initiates. Another responds. A chase begins, then shifts, then dissolves. There are rules, unspoken but understood, signals that indicate when play is welcome, when it should stop, when it has gone too far. These interactions require sensitivity, awareness of others, the ability to read subtle cues. In this way, play becomes a training ground for social intelligence, a space where relationships are explored and refined, and within that space, bonds can form, not just between mates or family members, but between individuals who share a moment of mutual engagement, a shared experience. Even solitary play carries significance. A crow manipulating an object, turning it over, dropping it, retrieving it, is engaging with the physical world in a way that deepens understanding. Textures, weights, movements, all become part of a growing internal map. And because the action is not driven by necessity, it can be repeated, varied, extended. The crow is free to explore, free to discover. There is a lightness in this, a contrast to the more focused, purposeful behaviors we have seen before. And yet, it is not separate from them. It is connected. Because the same mind that crafts tools, that understands water levels, that navigates traffic, also needs space to move without constraint, to stretch, to test, to wander through possibilities. Play provides that space. It is where structure loosens, where patterns can shift, where new connections can form. And sometimes, within these moments of apparent aimlessness, new ideas emerge. A behavior discovered in play may later become useful. A movement refined in a game may become part of a strategy. The boundary between play and function is not fixed. It is fluid. What begins as exploration can become innovation. And so the crow plays, not because it must, but because it can, because its mind allows it, because within that freedom, there is value. As the night air moves gently through the branches and the world quiets into a softer rhythm, it becomes easier to imagine these moments. A crow alone, sliding once more down a smooth surface, wings slightly open, body relaxed. Another calling out, inviting a brief chase, a shared flight that loops and turns before dissolving into stillness again. These are small things, easily overlooked, but they reveal something essential. That intelligence is not only about solving problems or ensuring survival. It is also about engagement, about the ability to interact with the world in ways that are not strictly necessary, but deeply enriching. A sign that the mind is not confined, but open, responsive, alive to possibility. And perhaps, in these quiet, playful moments, we come closer to understanding the crow than in any other. Because here, without urgency, without pressure, it reveals a side of itself that is simply present, moving with the wind, responding to the world, not out of need, but out of interest. And in that interest, there is a kind of freedom. A reminder that even within the demands of survival, there is space, however small, for something lighter, something that exists not to endure, but to experience. And from those moments of lightness, of movement without urgency, the story returns to something more subtle. Because even in stillness, even when no wings are spread, the crow is never truly silent. Its voice carries through the air, sharp, textured, deliberate. A single call can seem simple to human ears, a rough caw echoing across distance. But this, too, is an illusion, a reduction shaped by the limits of our perception. For within that sound, there are layers. Variations in pitch, in duration, in rhythm, in intensity. Slight shifts that transform meaning, that signal different intentions, different states, different messages entirely. Researchers who have spent years listening, recording, analyzing, have identified a remarkable range of vocalizations within crow communities. Not just a handful, but dozens, even hundreds of distinct patterns, each one carrying its own nuance. A sharp, repeated call may signal alarm, a warning that something is wrong, that attention is needed immediately. It spreads quickly, from one crow to another, rising in urgency as it travels. A softer series of notes, lower in intensity, may serve as a contact call, a way of maintaining connection across distance, of saying, in effect, I am here. There are calls used during courtship, subtle shifts in tone that accompany proximity that reinforce bonds between mates. There are calls directed toward young, guiding, correcting, responding to need. And then there are the quieter sounds, almost hidden, a kind of murmuring, a low, complex vocalization exchanged between individuals in close proximity. These are not meant to travel far. They exist within the space between two crows, carrying meaning that does not need to be broadcast. Private communication. In these moments, the crow's voice becomes something more than a signal. It becomes a language of relationship. Not structured like human language, not composed of words or grammar in the way we understand it, but still rich, still expressive, still capable of conveying a wide range of information. And like all living systems, it adapts. Crows do not produce their calls in isolation. They respond to one another, adjusting tone and timing based on context, on the behavior of others, on the environment itself. A call given in open space may differ from one given within dense trees, shaped by how sound travels, by how it must be heard. Over time, patterns emerge. Shared vocal habits develop within groups, subtle consistencies that allow members to recognize one another not just by sight, but by sound. In this way, the crow's voice becomes part of its identity, a signature carried on the air. There is also a rhythm to this communication, a pacing that reflects attention and intention. Calls are not constant, not random. They appear at specific moments, when needed, when something must be conveyed. Between these moments, there is quiet, a listening. Because communication is not only about speaking, it is about receiving, interpreting, responding. And the crow, with its finely tuned perception, does this continuously. A distant call is heard, evaluated, placed within context. Is it alarm? Is it contact? Is it something else? The response follows, not automatically, but appropriately. This dynamic exchange creates a network, a web of sound that connects individuals across space. Information moves through this network, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, depending on urgency. A single crow's call can ripple outward, influencing the behavior of many others. In this way, communication becomes a form of coordination, a means of aligning actions, of sharing awareness, of maintaining cohesion within the group. And yet, it remains fluid, unfixed, because each moment is different, each situation unique. The crow does not rely on rigid patterns alone. It adjusts, modifies, fine-tunes its voice to fit what is needed. There is a kind of musicality in this, not in the sense of melody as humans define it, but in the interplay of variation and repetition, of tone and silence, of call and response, a living soundscape shaped by interaction. As the night deepens, these sounds take on a different quality. They become more distinct, more noticeable against the quiet. A single call can travel farther, its edges clearer in the still air, and in that clarity, the complexity becomes more apparent. What once seemed like a simple cry now reveals layers, textures, subtle shifts that suggest meaning beyond the obvious. It invites attention, listening. And as we listen, something begins to change, because the more closely we attend to these sounds, the more we begin to sense that they are not random, not interchangeable, but purposeful. Each call placed with intention, each response shaped by understanding. This realization draws us closer, not physically, but perceptually. We begin to hear not just noise, but communication, not just sound, but signal. And within that signal, a glimpse of the crow's inner world. A world where voice and meaning are intertwined, where information flows not through symbols on a page, but through vibrations in the air. There is a quiet intimacy in this, to share space with a species that is constantly speaking, constantly listening, even if we do not fully understand the content. We are surrounded by conversations, ongoing, layered, unfolding just beyond our comprehension. And the crow moves within this space effortlessly, calling, responding, adjusting, maintaining connection with others through a system that is both simple in form and complex in function. As one crow calls, another answers. A third shifts position, responding not just to the sound, but to what it implies. Movement follows communication, and communication follows movement, each influencing the other in a continuous loop. This is how the group remains coordinated, how it adapts, how it responds to change. not through centralized control, but through distributed awareness, shared across individuals, carried by voice. And within this system, the crow finds its place, not isolated, but connected, a single voice among many, contributing to a larger pattern. As the sound fades into the night and silence returns once more, there is a lingering sense of presence, that even in quiet, the potential for communication remains, that at any moment, a call may rise again, carrying with it meaning, intention, connection. And in that possibility, the crow continues its dialogue with the world, a dialogue shaped not by words, but by sound. And as those sounds travel, as voices cross open air and weave through branches and buildings, something subtle begins to emerge. A difference, not in what is being said, but in how it is said. Because a crow's voice is not identical everywhere. It shifts, gently, from place to place. A crow in a dense forest calls with a tone that carries through leaves and trunks, shaped by the need to travel around obstacles. The sound may be deeper, more resonant, designed to move through layers of green and shadow. A crow in an open field, where wind moves freely and distance stretches outward, may call differently. Sharper, more direct, cutting cleanly across space. And in the city, where noise rises constantly, engines, footsteps, distant echoes bouncing from hard surfaces, the crow adjusts again. Its call becomes more pronounced, sometimes louder, sometimes altered in rhythm, adapted to stand out against the human-made soundscape. These are not conscious decisions in the way we might imagine. They are gradual shifts, shaped over time through interaction with the environment and with other crows. And as these shifts accumulate, something recognizable forms, a kind of vocal identity tied to place, what we might think of in human terms as an accent. Within a particular region, crows share similar patterns of sound. Their calls align in subtle ways, forming a local dialect that distinguishes them from crows in other areas. The differences may be slight, almost imperceptible to us, but to the crows themselves, they carry meaning. They signal familiarity, belonging. A crow entering a new territory may sound different, its calls not quite matching the established patterns. And this difference can be noticed, responded to. It becomes part of the social landscape. Over time, the newcomer may adjust, its calls gradually shifting to align more closely with those around it. Not through instruction, but through exposure, through repeated interaction, a slow convergence, the voice adapting to fit the group. This process reveals something profound, that communication, even without formal language, can evolve culturally. That patterns of sound can be shared, maintained, and modified within a community. And that individuals can learn these patterns, integrating them into their own behavior. It is a quiet form of learning, subtle, continuous, embedded within daily life. No clear beginning, no defined endpoint, just a gradual shaping, guided by the need to connect. There is also a deeper layer to this adaptation, because sound does not exist in isolation. It interacts with space, with air, with the structures through which it moves. A call that works well in one environment may be less effective in another. And so, over generations, the vocal patterns of crows become attuned not only to one another, but to the landscapes they inhabit. Forest, coastline, urban center. Each leaves its imprint on the voice. This is not a fixed imprint, but a dynamic one. As environments change, as cities grow, as natural spaces shift, the crow's voice shifts with them. It is always adjusting, always refining, a living system. And within this system, identity is expressed, not just as an individual, but as part of a place. A crow's call carries with it traces of where it belongs, echoes of the environment that shaped it, the influence of those it has learned from. To listen closely is to hear not just a sound, but a history, a layered composition of experience and adaptation. As the night deepens, these differences become more subtle, more difficult to distinguish, yet still present. A call from one direction, slightly different from another. A pattern that repeats in one group, but not in the next. These are quiet signals, easy to overlook, but rich with meaning. They remind us that communication is not static, that even within a species, variation exists, and that this variation is not random. It is shaped, refined, passed along. There is something familiar in this, something that mirrors our own experience of language and place. The way human voices carry traces of origin, of community, of shared patterns learned over time. But in the crow, this process unfolds without words, without written forms, without formal teaching. It emerges naturally, through interaction, through the simple act of listening and responding. And perhaps this is what makes it so compelling, that such complexity can arise without structure imposed from above, that it can grow organically, shaped by countless small exchanges, each one contributing to the whole. As a crow calls out into the dark, its voice carries not only its immediate message, but the subtle imprint of its world, the space it inhabits, the group it belongs to, the patterns it has absorbed. And somewhere, another crow hears, recognizes, responds, not just to the call itself, but to what it represents, a familiar sound, a shared identity, a connection that extends beyond the individual. As the echo fades and silence returns once more, the idea lingers, that even within something as simple as a call, there exists a depth of variation, a richness shaped by place and time. And that to truly hear it is to listen not just for sound, but for difference, for the quiet ways in voice can carry the story of where it comes from and where it belongs. And in that listening, the world becomes just a little more detailed, a little more alive, as if each call, each variation, adds another thread to the vast, unseen tapestry of communication that surrounds us. And as those voices carry the imprint of place, as each call becomes a quiet signature of belonging, the story opens once more into something unexpected. Because beyond the patterns shaped by environment, beyond the subtle differences of dialect, there is another dimension to the crow's voice, one that reaches outward, beyond its own kind. The crow is not limited to speaking only as a crow. It can imitate, not perfectly, not always with precision, but with a surprising degree of flexibility. Sounds that originate from other sources, animals, machines, even fragments of human speech, can be drawn into its repertoire. At first, this may seem like a curiosity, an echo without meaning, but as with so many aspects of the crow's behavior, there is more beneath the surface. Imagine a quiet space at the edge of a city, where natural sounds blend with human activity. A crow perches nearby, listening. It hears the call of another bird, the bark of a dog, the distant rhythm of a mechanical noise repeated again and again. These sounds enter its awareness, not as background, but as patterns. Over time, through repeated exposure, the crow begins to reproduce fragments of what it hears. A clipped version of a call, a rough imitation of a sound, adjusted to fit the structure of its own vocal system. The result is not an exact copy, but it is recognizable, close enough to suggest intention. This ability to mimic arises from the crow's control over its vocal organ, the syrinx, a complex structure that allows birds to produce a wide range of sounds. Combined with its keen auditory perception and memory, this control enables the crow to experiment with sound in ways that go beyond fixed calls. It becomes a kind of acoustic exploration, testing, adjusting, refining. And within this exploration, possibility emerges. In some cases, mimicry appears to serve a practical function. A crow may reproduce a sound that confuses another animal, momentarily disrupting its behavior, creating an opportunity, a distraction, a misdirection. In other moments, the purpose is less clear. A crow repeating a sound without an obvious outcome, as if engaged in practice, or perhaps in something closer to play. Because just as objects can be explored, movements tested, so too can sound. The crow listens, then responds. Not always with a fixed goal, but with curiosity. And through this curiosity, its vocal world expands. There is something deeply intriguing in this capacity, because mimicry requires more than simple repetition. It requires perception, memory, and the ability to transform what is heard into something that can be produced. It is a translation from one form of sound into another. And within that translation, the crow demonstrates a kind of flexibility that blurs the boundary between fixed instinct and open-ended learning. It becomes, in a sense, an interpreter of its environment, not limited to its own voice, but capable of incorporating elements from beyond. This raises subtle questions about communication. When a crow mimics a sound, what is it expressing? Is it signaling something specific, or simply exploring the range of what it can do? Is the sound directed outward, meant to influence others, or inward, part of a process of learning and refinement? The answers are not always clear, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes the behavior so compelling, because it suggests that the crow's vocal world is not closed. It is permeable, open to influence, capable of change. There are rare moments, often reported quietly, almost with hesitation, where crows have been heard producing sounds that resemble human speech. Not words in the full sense, not language as we use it, but fragments, echoes, shaped by the crow's vocal system into something that feels almost familiar. These moments are fleeting, unexpected, a sound that catches the ear, that lingers just long enough to be noticed, then fades. They do not occur often, and they are not consistent. But they point to a possibility, that the crow's capacity for sound extends further than we typically imagine, that it can reach, however briefly, into the acoustic patterns of another species and bring something back. There is something almost dreamlike in this, to hear, within the voice of a crow, a reflection of a sound that belongs to a different world, a blending of boundaries, a reminder that communication is not fixed, but fluid. As the night deepens and the layers of sound grow thinner, these subtle imitations become easier to notice. A call that seems slightly out of place, a rhythm that echoes something familiar, yet remains distinctly crow-like. These are small moments, but they reveal a mind that is listening actively, continuously, a mind that does not simply produce sound, but engages with it, responds to it, experiments with it, and in doing so, expands its own range of expression. This expansion does not replace the crow's natural calls. Those remain forming the core of its communication. But around that core, there is flexibility, a willingness to incorporate, to adapt, to explore. And perhaps this is another expression of the crow's broader nature, its ability to move between worlds, between forest and city, between natural patterns and human systems, between fixed behavior and creative response. The voice becomes another pathway for this movement, a bridge, connecting the crow not only to its own kind, but to the wider soundscape in which it lives. As a crow lifts its head and releases a call into the darkness, there is always the possibility that what emerges will carry something unexpected, a familiar note, or something slightly altered, a reflection, or a variation. And somewhere, another ear may catch it, respond, interpret, or simply listen, without fully understanding, yet aware that something more is present. As the sound fades, leaving only the quiet hum of night, the idea lingers, that the crow's voice is not fixed, that it is capable of reaching beyond itself, of drawing in fragments of the world and reshaping them into something new. And in that reshaping, something subtle is revealed. A mind that is not only responsive, but creative, not only structured, but open, a presence that listens, learns, and when the moment allows, experiments. And as the crow's voice reaches beyond itself, as it begins to echo fragments of the wider world, the story drifts further still, into the realm where observation becomes myth. Because long before science listened carefully to the crow, long before experiments revealed its intelligence, people were already watching, already wondering, already telling stories. In the cold, wind-shaped landscapes of the north, beneath skies that stretch wide and pale, there lived a figure whose presence carried both power and mystery. The god Odin, a seeker of knowledge, a wanderer between worlds, a being who sacrificed much to understand what lies beneath the surface of things. And always, at his side or above him, or far beyond the horizon, there were two crows, Hugin and Munin. Their names carry meaning. Hugin, often understood as thought, Munin as memory. Each day they would leave, flying out across the vast expanse of the nine worlds, over forests and mountains, across rivers and seas, into places where even gods could not easily reach. They would observe, listen, gather what they could, and then, as the day closed, they would return, settling upon Odin's shoulders, whispering into his ears everything they had seen, everything they had learned. Through them, he knew. Through them, the world became visible. There is something quietly profound in this image, because it does not portray the crow, more precisely, the raven, its close relative, as a mere animal. It becomes a bridge, a carrier of awareness, a being capable of moving between realms, between distances, between the known and the unknown. And in doing so, it transforms into a symbol, not just of presence, but of perception itself. Thought and memory, two forces that shape understanding, two companions that travel outward, gathering fragments of reality, then returning to form a coherent whole. In this way, the myth mirrors something we have already begun to see: the crow's ability to observe, to remember, to carry information across time and space, its role as both witness and interpreter. It is easy to imagine how such a connection formed. To ancient observers, the crow was not an ordinary creature. It appeared at moments of significance, at the edges of battlefields, near places of transition, in landscapes where life and death stood close together. It watched, waited, returned. Its presence felt intentional, almost knowing, and so meaning gathered around it. Stories formed, symbols emerged, the crow became more than itself. It became an extension of something larger, a messenger, a guide, a keeper of what is seen and what is remembered. In the myth of Hugin and Munin, there is also a subtle tension. Odin, for all his power, expresses concern. He fears that one day, his companions may not return. That thought or memory might be lost. This fear reveals something essential, that knowledge is not guaranteed, that awareness must be maintained, that the act of observing the world and carrying it within is both powerful and fragile. And perhaps this too resonates with the crow, because its intelligence, its ability to remember, to interpret, to adapt, is not static. It depends on continued interaction, on attention, on engagement with the world. The crow must keep observing, keep learning, keep returning to what it has seen. Just as Hugin and Munin must continue their daily flight, there is a rhythm here, a cycle, departure, observation, return, again and again, each day bringing new information, new patterns, new possibilities, and within that repetition, a kind of continuity emerges, a steady accumulation of understanding. As the night deepens and the boundaries between story and reality begin to soften, it becomes easier to feel the weight of this symbolism. To imagine the crow not just as a bird, but as a presence that moves between layers of existence, between what is visible and what is known, between the outer world and the inner one. Its dark feathers, absorbing light, reflecting only faint hints of color, seem to echo this role, a being that carries within it something hidden, something not immediately revealed. And its voice, sharp and deliberate, cuts through silence like a message that demands attention, not easily ignored, not easily forgotten. Even today, in a world shaped by science and technology, these ancient associations have not entirely faded. The crow still appears at the edges of our awareness, often linked, however subtly, to moments of change, of transition, of quiet reflection. We notice it, even if we do not fully understand why. Perhaps because something in its nature continues to resonate with the deeper patterns of human thought. The need to observe, to remember, to make sense of what we encounter. And in this way, the story of Hugin and Munin becomes more than myth. It becomes a lens, a way of seeing the crow not only as a biological being, but as a reflection of something within ourselves. The part that travels outward, gathering experience, and the part that returns, holding it in memory. As the imagined wings of those two ancient companions fade into the dark, as their flight stretches beyond the edges of the visible world, the image lingers. A figure seated in stillness, waiting, listening, dependent not on sight alone, but on what is brought back. And somewhere, beyond that image, in the quiet branches of the present night, a real crow shifts its position, watches, listens, remembers, carrying within it, not myth, but something just as enduring. A living echo of the same ancient pattern, observation and return, thought and memory, again and again, without end. And as the echoes of ancient northern skies fade, as thought and memory complete their endless flight, the story drifts eastward, carried on a quieter wind. Across mountains, across seas, into a landscape where the sun rises through mist and myth takes a different shape. Here the crow is not only a watcher, it is a guide. In the traditions of Japan, there exists a figure both striking and enigmatic, a crow unlike any other. Yatagarasu, a being with 3 legs, descending from the heavens, its dark wings cutting across light, its presence tied not to shadow or omen, but to direction, to guidance. In the ancient chronicles, Yatagarasu appears at a moment of uncertainty. A journey unfolds, a path unclear, a destination hidden beyond unfamiliar terrain. And then, from above, the crow arrives. Not to command, not to control, but to lead. It flies ahead, marking the way, offering orientation in a world where direction is easily lost. There is something subtle in this role, because guidance, in its truest form, does not force. It reveals. It provides just enough clarity for movement to continue, without removing the need for awareness, for attention, for choice. And in this way, Yatagarasu becomes a symbol of alignment, between intention and path, between uncertainty and understanding. Its 3 legs, often seen as unusual, carry layers of meaning. In some interpretations, they represent the balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. In others, they signify the movement of the sun across the sky, a celestial rhythm made visible. But regardless of interpretation, the image remains powerful. A crow, not grounded, but elevated. Not observing from the margins, but moving at the center of direction itself. This stands in quiet contrast to other portrayals we have encountered. The crow as watcher, the crow as memory. Here, it becomes something more active. A participant in the unfolding of events. A presence that shapes movement, not through force, but through presence. And yet, even in this role, there is a continuity. Because to guide effectively, one must first understand. The crow must see the landscape, perceive its structure, recognize where paths lead and where they do not. It must hold a map, not written but lived. And this brings us back once more to the crow's nature. Its capacity to observe, to remember, to navigate complexity. In the myth, these qualities are elevated, given form in a being that bridges the human and the divine. But their roots remain, grounded in the real behaviors we have come to know. A crow that can navigate a city, that can read patterns of movement, that can adapt to changing environments, already carries within it the essence of a guide. Not in the grand symbolic sense, but in the quiet, practical way that shapes survival. And perhaps this is how such myths arise. Not from imagination alone, but from careful observation, slowly transformed into story, into symbol, into something that captures both what is seen and what is felt. Because to watch a crow, truly watch, is to witness a being that moves with purpose, that rarely seems lost, that pauses, considers, then proceeds with a kind of quiet certainty. It does not wander aimlessly. It explores, but with awareness. It adapts, but with direction. And in this, there is something that resonates deeply. A sense that it knows where it is going, even if that knowledge is not fixed, not absolute, but constantly updated through experience. As the night deepens, the image of Yatagarasu lingers, not as a distant myth, but as a reflection of a pattern that continues to exist. A crow in flight, crossing the sky, its path not random, but shaped by perception, by memory, by subtle cues invisible to us. It chooses a direction, adjusts midair, responds to currents, to landmarks, to the quiet signals that guide its movement. And in doing so, it embodies guidance, not as something imposed, but as something discovered. There is also a humility in this form of guidance. The crow does not remain. It does not linger to be acknowledged or to receive recognition. It appears, leads, and then continues. Its role is not to be seen, but to be followed if one is able to perceive it. And this, too, reflects something essential. That guidance often exists quietly, at the edges of awareness, not demanding attention, but offering it, waiting to be noticed. As the imagined figure of the three-legged crow fades into the darkness, replaced once more by the simple silhouette of a real bird perched against the night sky, the connection remains between myth and reality, between symbol and behavior, between the idea of guidance and the act of navigating the world. The crow does not declare itself as a guide. It simply moves with awareness, with intention. And in observing that movement, we may find something of our own, a reminder that direction is not always given, that it can be discovered through attention, through memory, through the quiet integration of what we have seen and learned, just as the crow does. Again and again, across landscapes both ancient and modern, following paths that are not always visible, yet always present. For those who learn how to see. And as the guiding shadow of the eastern sky fades, as the path dissolves back into the quiet fabric of night, the story turns once more. Not toward direction this time, but toward contradiction. Because in another part of the world, under different skies, the crow is not only a guide. It is something far more unpredictable, a trickster, a creator, a disruptor of order, and at times, the very force that brings order into being. Across many indigenous cultures of North America, there exists a figure whose presence is impossible to contain within a single meaning. The raven, not merely a bird, but a being who moves between roles, shifting from cunning deceiver to bringer of light, from selfish schemer to accidental creator. In one telling, the world begins in darkness, a darkness so complete that nothing can be seen, nothing can grow, nothing can take shape. Somewhere, hidden away, a powerful being guards the light, keeping it contained, away from the world. Raven, curious, restless, unwilling to accept the limits of this darkness, seeks a way to change it, not through strength, not through direct confrontation, but through cleverness, disguise, patience. He transforms himself, becomes something small, something unnoticed, slipping into the guarded space where the light is kept. He waits, watches, finds the moment when vigilance fades, and then he takes it, releasing the light into the world, scattering it across sky and land, giving shape to what was once unseen. Day emerges, color appears, the world awakens, and yet, Raven is not a pure hero. In other stories, he is greedy, impulsive, driven by desire. He tricks others for his own gain, creates chaos, disrupts balance. Sometimes his actions lead to trouble, sometimes to transformation, often both at once. This duality is essential. Raven is not defined by a single moral position. He exists in the space between, where creation and disruption intertwine, where intention does not always align with outcome, where the unexpected becomes the source of change. There is something deeply resonant in this, because it reflects a truth that extends beyond myth, that the forces shaping the world are not always orderly, not always predictable, that innovation, transformation, often arise from moments of imbalance, from actions that break existing patterns. And here, once again, we find a connection to the crow, because the behaviors we have seen, the tool-making, the problem-solving, the adaptation to new environments, all carry within them a trace of this same unpredictability. The crow does not always follow established paths. It experiments, it tests boundaries, it finds new ways of interacting with the world, sometimes in ways that appear disruptive, unexpected, even chaotic. A crow dropping nuts into traffic, bending a branch into a hook, mimicking unfamiliar sounds. These are not behaviors that fit neatly into fixed patterns. They are acts of exploration, of creative deviation. And in this, the crow mirrors the essence of the trickster, not as a moral figure, but as a force of change, a presence that unsettles the familiar, and in doing so, reveals new possibilities. In many indigenous traditions, Raven's actions, even when flawed, are not meaningless. They carry lessons. They show what happens when boundaries are crossed, when desire leads to unintended consequences, when cleverness outpaces wisdom. But they also demonstrate that from these moments, something new can emerge. Light, knowledge, transformation. The world becomes richer, more complex through these disruptions. And perhaps this is why Raven remains such a powerful symbol, because it acknowledges that creation is not always clean, not always deliberate, that it can arise from missteps, from curiosity, from actions that do not fully anticipate their outcomes. As the night deepens and the edges of thought soften, this idea begins to settle, that the crow, in its real living form, carries echoes of this ancient pattern, not in mythic scale, not in grand acts of cosmic change, but in small, continuous adjustments. Each time it solves a new problem, it shifts the boundaries of what is possible. Each time it adapts to a new environment, it reshapes its relationship with the world. Each time it experiments, it introduces variation, and through variation, change becomes possible. There is also a certain independence in this. The crow does not wait for instruction. It does not rely solely on inherited patterns. It acts, tests, learns, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but always moving, always engaging with the unknown. This is the essence of the trickster. Not bound by fixed roles, not confined to predictable outcomes, but alive within the space of possibility. As the imagined figure of Raven moves through the darkness, shifting shape, carrying light in one moment, creating confusion in the next, we begin to see that this duality is not something to be resolved. It is something to be understood, accepted, because within it lies the capacity for transformation. And perhaps this is why the crow continues to captivate human imagination, because it reflects not only the order we seek, but the unpredictability we experience, the balance between structure and change, between knowing and discovering. As the story returns, once more, to the quiet presence of a crow in the night, perched still, watching, the layers of meaning settle around it, not as something imposed, but as something that has grown naturally through centuries of observation, of storytelling, of reflection. The crow does not carry these myths consciously. It does not act them out with intention. And yet, through its behavior, through its intelligence, through its constant engagement with the world, it embodies them in fragments, in echoes, in patterns that feel both ancient and immediate. And so it remains, a figure at the edge of certainty, a presence that can guide, observe, remember, and disrupt, all at once. A reminder that the world is not fixed. that it is shaped continuously by forces both subtle and unexpected, and that within those forces there is always the possibility of something new emerging from the dark. And from that shifting edge, where creation and disruption meet, the story turns inward once more, toward the human mind. Because there are moments when the crow does not remain outside us, perched on a branch, circling in the sky, or moving through myth. Instead, it enters the quiet spaces of thought. It becomes a symbol, a presence that lingers at the threshold between what is known and what cannot quite be grasped. Few images capture this more clearly than the solitary bird that appears in the dim chamber of a restless mind, tapping gently at the boundary between reality and imagination. The crow, more precisely, the raven, has long held a place within literature as a figure of mystery, of repetition, of something that refuses to leave. In the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, this presence takes form. A dark bird enters a quiet room, perching above a door, speaking only a single word, nevermore. Again and again, the word returns, each repetition carrying a slightly different weight, shaped by the thoughts of the listener, by the questions asked, by the longing beneath them. At first, the bird seems almost incidental, an intrusion, a curiosity. But as the night deepens, as the mind of the narrator begins to circle its own questions, its own losses, the bird transforms. It becomes something more than itself, a mirror, a voice that does not answer, but reflects. The crow, in this literary space, is not a messenger of external knowledge. It is a catalyst for internal revelation, a presence that draws attention inward, toward memory, toward grief, toward the patterns of thought that repeat without resolution. There is something profoundly human in this, because the mind, like the crow's call, often returns to the same place, revisits the same questions, turns over the same memories again and again, seeking meaning, seeking closure, sometimes finding neither. And in that repetition, the boundary between reality and interpretation begins to blur. The bird says only one word, but the listener hears many meanings, each shaped not by the sound itself, but by the state of the mind receiving it. This dynamic reveals something essential about perception, that what we encounter is not always what is there. It is also what we bring to it, our memories, our expectations, our fears, our hopes. The crow, silent or speaking, becomes a surface upon which these inner patterns are projected. And in this way, it takes on a different kind of life, not biological, not mythological, but psychological, a presence within the landscape of thought. This is why the image persists, why the crow continues to appear in stories, in poems, in quiet moments of reflection, because it occupies a space that is difficult to define, between observer and participant, between external reality and internal experience. It watches, but it also seems to understand. It is silent, but it seems to speak. And perhaps this is because the crow already carries so many qualities that resonate with the human mind. Memory, attention, adaptability, a sensitivity to patterns. When these qualities are reflected back at us, through art, through literature, they take on new meaning. They become part of our own attempt to understand ourselves. There is also a certain stillness in the image of the crow in literature, a refusal to leave. In The Raven, the bird remains unmoving, unchanging, even as the thoughts around it shift and intensify. This stillness contrasts with the restless movement of the mind. The more the narrator questions, the more the bird remains the same, a fixed point. And in that contrast, tension arises, because the mind seeks change, seeks resolution, while the presence before it offers none. Only repetition, never more. This repetition becomes a kind of rhythm, a pattern that shapes the unfolding of thought. And here, once again, we see a parallel with the crow's real-world behavior. Its calls, repeated, varied, carrying meaning through rhythm and tone. Its memory, holding on to patterns, returning to them. Its presence, steady, observant. In literature, these qualities are distilled, intensified, focused into a single image, an image that lingers long after the words have ended. As the night deepens and the boundaries of wakefulness soften, it becomes easier to feel this presence. Not as something external, but as something that arises within. A thought that returns, a memory that does not fade, a question that remains unanswered. And in that space, the crow takes its place. Perched quietly, not demanding attention, but impossible to ignore. There is no need for movement, no need for change. Its role is simply to be there, to witness, to reflect, to remain. And perhaps this is why the crow continues to inhabit both the outer world and the inner one, because it bridges them. It exists as a living creature, moving through forests and cities, solving problems, forming relationships. And it exists as a symbol, moving through stories and thoughts, shaping how we interpret what we experience. These two forms are not separate. They inform one another. The real crow gives rise to the symbol. The symbol, in turn, shapes how we see the real. As the imagined bird in the dimly lit room fades, as its single word dissolves into silence, the presence does not entirely disappear. It lingers, in the quiet corners of thought, in the spaces where memory and meaning intersect. And somewhere, beyond that inner landscape, a real crow calls into the night. Its voice sharp, clear, grounded in the present moment. Not repeating a single word, but carrying its own complex signals, its own meanings, its own place in the world. The two images overlap, just for a moment, then separate, one returning to the sky, the other remaining within. And in that brief overlap, something is revealed. That the crow is not only a creature we observe, but a presence through which we come to observe ourselves. And as that inner echo softens, as the image of the silent watcher in the mind slowly dissolves, the story returns once more to the outer world, to movement, to breath, to the living systems that continue quietly beyond our thoughts. Because not all connections are built on memory alone, or on symbol, or even on shared space. Some are forged through cooperation, through unlikely alliances that emerge in the shifting balance of survival. Across vast landscapes, forests, tundra, open plains, there are moments when the crow is not alone, not with its own kind, but alongside another presence, one very different in form, yet aligned in purpose. The wolf. At first glance, the two seem distant. One moves across the sky, light, observant, untethered. The other moves along the earth, grounded, powerful, guided by scent and endurance. But in certain conditions, their paths converge. A wolf pack hunts. It follows tracks, reads subtle changes in the terrain, moves with patience through long distances. The outcome is uncertain. A hunt may succeed or fail. Energy is spent, time passes, and not every attempt leads to reward. Above or nearby, crows watch. They do not hunt in the same way. They do not chase or bring down large prey, but they observe keenly, constantly scanning the landscape for signs of opportunity. And when a wolf succeeds, when a large animal falls, the balance shifts. The wolf, strong as it is, cannot easily access everything at once. Thick hide, heavy muscle, a barrier that takes time and effort to open. This is where the crow enters. It lands nearby, cautious at first, aware of the wolf's presence, of the tension that still lingers around the fallen form. It waits, watches, gauges the moment. The wolf tears into the hide, opening what was sealed, and in doing so, it creates access, for itself and for others. The crow approaches, not as a competitor in the traditional sense, but as a participant in a shared opportunity. It feeds, carefully, taking what it can. The wolf tolerates this presence, sometimes ignoring it, sometimes reacting briefly, but rarely driving it away completely. Because the crow's presence does not threaten the core of the resource. It takes small portions, fragments, what can be carried. And in return, something subtle occurs. The crow becomes a scout. In some observed cases, crows have been seen leading wolves toward potential prey, or toward carcasses they themselves cannot access. Their ability to see from above, to cover distance quickly, gives them information the wolf does not have. They circle, call, draw attention. The wolf responds, moves in that direction, and when the outcome is successful, both benefit. This is not cooperation in the structured sense. There is no agreement, no shared intention as we might define it. And yet, the interaction creates a system, a pattern in which two very different species influence one another's behavior in ways that increase their chances of survival. There is a quiet elegance in this, because it does not rely on sameness. The crow and the wolf do not need to understand each other fully. They do not need to communicate directly in complex ways. They simply respond to signals, to presence, to opportunity. And over time, these responses align. A crow learns that following wolves can lead to food. A wolf learns that the presence of circling crows may indicate something worth investigating. Each adjusts subtly based on experience. And from these adjustments, a relationship forms, not fixed, not guaranteed, but recurring, emergent. There is something deeply natural in this kind of connection. It reflects a broader principle that survival is not always solitary, that within the complexity of ecosystems, interactions arise that link different lives together, sometimes in unexpected ways. The crow, adaptable, observant, mobile, becomes a bridge, moving between spaces, carrying information, responding to patterns beyond its own immediate needs. The wolf, grounded, persistent, powerful, transforms the environment in ways that create new possibilities. Together, without intention, they shape one another's world. As the night deepens and the imagined scene settles into stillness, it becomes easier to feel the quiet rhythm of this interaction. A wolf moving through shadow, its breath visible in the cold air. Above, a crow gliding silently, its wings steady, its eyes searching. Neither aware, perhaps, of the full extent of the connection, and yet linked, through movement, through observation, through the shared reality of survival. There is no need for recognition, no need for acknowledgement. The system functions without it. Each plays a role, not assigned, but discovered. And in that discovery, balance emerges. Not perfect, not static, but dynamic, responsive, alive. As the image fades, replaced once more by the quiet presence of a crow alone in the night, the idea remains that even within independence, there are threads that connect, invisible at first, but real, shaping behavior, influencing outcomes, weaving together lives that might otherwise seem separate. And the crow, ever attentive, ever adaptable, moves within these threads, sometimes alone, sometimes alongside others, always observing, always learning, always ready to respond to the subtle signals that reveal where opportunity lies. In this way, it becomes not just a survivor, but a participant in something larger. A network of relationships, extending beyond species, beyond simple definitions, into the deeper patterns that sustain life. And within those patterns, the crow continues its quiet journey, not isolated, but connected in ways both seen and unseen. And from those quiet alliances, from the invisible threads that bind one life to another, the story turns again, this time toward a connection that feels almost improbable, not between crow and wolf, but between crow and us. Because there are moments scattered across different places, different lives, where the distance between species narrows, not through necessity, not through survival alone, but through something more delicate. Attention, repeated over time. A person leaves food outside, a small offering, nothing elaborate. At first, the crow approaches with caution. It watches from a distance, measuring risk, reading posture, waiting for signs. Days pass. The offering appears again, always in the same place, always without threat. Gradually, the distance shortens. The crow lands closer, feeds more quickly, then lingers just for a moment before lifting away. A pattern forms, not imposed but discovered. The human continues. The crow responds. And over time, something shifts. Recognition. The crow begins to distinguish this particular person from others, not just as a shape, but as an individual. A presence associated with safety, with consistency, with a reliable source of food. It arrives sooner, waits nearby, sometimes even calling, a quiet signal that it is there. And then, in rare and often unexpected ways, the pattern deepens. Small objects appear, a fragment of something reflective, a piece of metal, a bead, a coin. A shard of glass catching the light, left near the place where food has been offered. At first, this seems accidental, a coincidence, but when it happens again and again, a different interpretation begins to take shape. A gesture, not in the human sense of deliberate gift-giving, not with intention as we define it, but as part of a behavioral pattern that echoes exchange. The crow collects objects, as it often does, drawn to novelty, to brightness, to texture. But here, the objects are not kept. They are placed, left behind, in the same space where something has been received. This phenomenon has been documented in scattered accounts, quiet stories shared by individuals who have formed long-term interactions with local crows. Not universal, not guaranteed, but present enough to suggest a pattern worth noticing. It raises questions. What does the crow perceive in this interaction? Is it associating the human with a stable resource and reinforcing that connection through behavior? Is it simply exploring, placing objects as part of its own curiosity? Or is there, within its cognitive framework, a rudimentary form of reciprocity? The answers remain open, but the behavior itself is real. And in that reality, something remarkable emerges. A moment where two very different forms of intelligence meet, not in dominance, not in conflict, but in a kind of quiet exchange. The human offers food. The crow responds with presence, with recognition, and sometimes with something returned. There is no contract, no expectation, only a pattern sustained through repetition. And within that pattern, a relationship forms, fragile, subtle, dependent on consistency and trust. If the pattern breaks, if the human disappears, if the environment changes, the connection fades. But while it exists, it creates a space where boundaries soften, where the crow is no longer just a distant observer, and the human no longer just part of the background. They become participants in each other's awareness. There is something deeply grounding in this, because it reminds us that connection does not always require similarity. It does not require shared language or shared perception. It can arise simply from repeated interaction, from mutual adjustment, from the willingness to remain present over time. The crow does not become human. The human does not become crow. And yet, something passes between them. Recognition. A subtle acknowledgement that the other exists, not as an abstraction, but as an individual. This acknowledgement changes behavior. The human may move more slowly, speak more softly, become aware of how presence is perceived. The crow may approach more closely, linger longer, reveal behaviors that would otherwise remain hidden. Each influences the other, not through force, but through attention. And in that attention, a small bridge forms. Not permanent, not fixed, but real. As the night deepens and the imagined exchange settles into stillness, the image lingers, a quiet space, a simple offering, a dark figure landing, cautious, deliberate, and beside it something small, left behind, a reflection of light in the darkness. It is easy to overlook these moments, to dismiss them as coincidence or as curiosity without meaning. But to do so is to miss something subtle, that within the complexity of the natural world, there are opportunities for connection that do not fit neatly into categories. Moments where behavior crosses boundaries, where patterns emerge that are neither fully instinctive nor fully intentional, but something in between. And the crow, with its flexible mind, its sensitivity to patterns, its capacity for memory, stands at the center of these moments. It notices, remembers, responds, and sometimes it gives. Not as we would define giving, but as part of a system of interaction that carries echoes of exchange. As the final traces of this scene fade and the quiet returns, the idea remains that the crow is not only a creature of forests, of cities, of myth and symbol. It is also a neighbor, a presence that shares our spaces, observes our movements, adapts to our patterns, and on occasion reaches back. Not with words, not with intention we can fully understand, but with something small, tangible, left in the place where connection has been made. A reminder that even across the boundaries of species, there are moments where awareness meets awareness, and something passes between them, unspoken, uncertain, but unmistakably there. And as that quiet exchange fades, as the small, reflective object rests where it was left, the story moves toward its final horizon. Not an ending, but a widening. Because the crow does not belong only to forests, or to myths, or to the edges of human attention. It is here, in the present, in the spaces we shape, and the spaces that continue to change around us. Cities expand, lights grow brighter, sounds multiply, constant, layered, unceasing. The night itself is no longer fully dark. It glows, softly in some places, intensely in others, reshaping the rhythms of countless lives. Many species retreat, some disappear, others struggle to adapt, their patterns disrupted, their signals drowned out, their habitats fragmented. And yet, the crow remains, not unchanged, but responsive, observant, learning. It moves along the edges of buildings, perches on wires that hum faintly with energy, navigates streets where movement is governed not by instinct, but by machines and signals. It watches, as it always has, but now the patterns it observes are different. Traffic lights, pedestrian flows, artificial rhythms replacing natural ones, and slowly it integrates them. We have already seen glimpses of this. Crows dropping nuts onto roads, timing their descent with the changing of lights, retrieving food in the brief windows of safety. But this is only one example among many. The crow adapts to noise, altering the timing and intensity of its calls so they can still be heard. It adjusts to light, extending or shifting its periods of activity in response to the glow of cities that never fully sleep. It explores new materials, using fragments of human-made objects in its nests, incorporating plastic, wire, fabric, weaving them into structures that reflect a changing world. Even more quietly, it observes us. Our routines, our habits, the times we appear, the places we return to, the objects we leave behind. And through this observation, it continues to learn, not about nature alone, but about us. There is something both humbling and slightly unsettling in this. To realize that as we build, as we expand, as we reshape the environment, we are also being watched, not in a threatening way, but attentively. The crow does not resist change in the way we might expect. It studies it, finds openings within it, adapts its behavior to align with new conditions. And in doing so, it becomes one of the few species that not only survives alongside us, but thrives. This resilience is not accidental. It is the result of everything we have seen: its flexible mind, its memory, its social learning, its willingness to explore, to test, to adjust. The crow does not cling to a fixed way of being. It evolves, continuously, in response to what is present. And because of this, it becomes something more than just a survivor. It becomes a witness, a living record of how the world changes. From ancient forests to modern cities, from mythic skies to electric light, the crow has moved through all of it, observing, adapting, remaining. There is a quiet continuity here, a thread that stretches across time, connecting past and present, nature and human creation. And along that thread, the crow travels, carrying with it everything it has learned, everything it continues to discover. As the night deepens one final time, and the rhythm of this journey begins to slow, the image settles. A single crow perched high above the ground, its form outlined against a sky that is no longer entirely dark. Below, the world moves. Lights flicker, sounds rise and fall, patterns shift, and the crow watches, not as an outsider, but as a participant, a neighbor, a presence that has learned how to exist within this shared space, without losing its own nature. There is something to be learned here, not as instruction, but as reflection. The crow does not resist complexity. It engages with it. It does not seek perfect control. It responds, moment by moment, to what is. It carries memory, but remains open to change. And perhaps, in this quiet way, it offers something back to us, a different perspective, a reminder that intelligence is not only about shaping the world, but about adapting within it. That survival is not only about strength, but about flexibility. That awareness, sustained over time, can reveal patterns we might otherwise miss. As the final silence begins to settle and the story gently comes to rest, the crow lifts its head. A brief pause, then a single call. Clear, distinct, carrying outward into the night, beyond buildings, beyond trees, into a space that continues to expand. And with that, the journey lingers. Not finished, but continuing. In the quiet awareness that follows. If this story has stayed with you, if somewhere within these shadows and wings you found a moment of stillness or a new way of seeing, then take a small moment now, gently, without urgency. You can support this journey by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might also find peace in these quiet stories. And if you feel it, leave a comment below. Not to explain, not to analyze, but simply to leave a trace of your presence, like a small object placed gently in the dark. A sign that you were here, that you listened, that, for a moment, your awareness met another. And as the night continues, and the crow disappears into the vast unfolding sky, rest. Let the world move quietly around you and carry this stillness with you a little further into whatever comes next.